It's the final of the Women's World Cup and we're into the tie breaks. So Divya Deshmukh, 19 years old, playing against Humpy Koneru, 38 years old. She's really the number one woman in India and has been for many years. But Divya is on the way up. So a fascinating clash of generations and styles as well. You could say that Divya is more enterprising, but Humpy very solid. So we had 2 draws in the classical games. Now we've got 2 rapid play games, 15 minutes plus 10 seconds per move. And if it's 1-1 after these 2, then the time control gets increasingly faster. So this was the final position in game 1. You can see that Divya has a queen against Humpy's rook and bishop. But the players agreed a draw here. You can see that Black has a blockade. Or not a blockade, a fortress. You can't touch Black's pieces, so the queen is ineffective. There's nothing to do, so, well, the players, this was just a draw by perpetual check. So draw in game 1, although I would say that Divya was maybe a little bit more enterprising with a pawn sack and won Humpy's queen, but couldn't make progress. So game 2. So Humpy with white. Again, it's rapid play, 15 minutes plus 10 seconds per move. Now I'm going to zip through the first few moves because I think the real contest came quite late on in an endgame. So what they're playing here is a Catalan, and although white sacrifices a pawn, very often this c4 pawn is sacrificed. This is actually very well known. Of course, white is trying to get some pressure on these queenside pawns here and the squares, but actually this is quite a well-known variation. And in fact, Black has few difficulties in this position. You can see, of course, against these split pawns, then white has a little bit of pressure, but actually Divya knows her stuff and she's got a very, very solid position. The only thing is it's very difficult for Black to make any progress here with the extra pawn. Difficult for white to make progress as well, because this extra pawn is so well blockaded. And we've seen similar games like this in the past. This knight does an excellent job, and Humpy decides to exchange it off before it lands on this very nice square on b4. So an exchange. So Divya is still a pawn up, but how do you make anything of this extra pawn? Securely blockaded. And this c6 pawn also isn't really going anywhere either. And because you can see these 3 major pieces are attacking the pawn on a5, then Divya can't move these pieces away. So there's a strange kind of stasis has been reached and not a lot going on. Although I would say that Humpy had consumed a bit more time. So not a lot going on. I mean, Black can't do anything on the king side because if g5, this gets taken, and then rook takes a5, just equal. So g6. So lots of shuffling. And Humpy was down to around about a little over a minute, but nothing has really happened. In this position, white could play queen c3 or rook a2. There's not a lot going on here. But this is where Humpy decided to play e4. Now, when I was watching this, I have to say I was really shocked by this decision. She spotted that after pawn takes pawn, d5, there's a pin. She obviously thought this was the moment when the king is on g7 and perhaps there's a spare check somewhere. This is the moment to maybe liquidate or even, get a strong passed pawn. But maybe she overlooked this move, queen e5. With a simple pin, also holding on to that e-pawn. Rook d1. And now if Divya had played rook d8, then white is in huge trouble because this pawn will be lost. I mean, it's not over yet because, after this simplification, well, I mean, black still has to work hard to win this rook and pawn endgame, actually, but it's 2 extra pawns. Good chances. But instead, Divya took on d5. Now, she's clearly better here, but it's not quite as clear as the other position. Now we've got our rook and pawn endgame. Still, you feel that white has excellent drawing chances, particularly with the double rooks, when this pawn is securely blockaded. If this rook could shift round to a3, then I think it would be quite hard for black to make progress. So that's why Divya started to shake things up with rook f6. It is possible to play the rook here and to defend the pawn laterally, and that might give black a better chance to move the king over, and then things might start to happen. So that's why Humpy played rook e5, hoping to drag the rook back to a6. And then it's very hard for black to make progress when the rooks are just consigned to defending that pawn. But instead, Divya tried rook f5. Very interesting idea. Maybe the best practical chance. So Humpy decided to exchange. Now we have a classic endgame position here, with the rook blockading the rook's pawn and black's rook behind the pawn. So that means that if white's rook moves away, this pawn will advance. So white's rook is passive. Now, under normal circumstances, black would want to move the king to b5 to push away the rook, and then the pawn would advance. There's this classic endgame, Alekhine Capablanca, World Championship match 1927, the final game, where Alekhine won a beautiful endgame, a classic endgame. So if I go to that position, so this is Alekhine Capablanca, not Humpy Divya. This is Alekhine Capablanca, final game. And this is a masterpiece. It's a classic. And this is the kind of template you have for this endgame. Basically, Alekhine brought the king over. Black's king had to come over. And then Alekhine switched after gaining a tempo with the rook. Then Alekhine switched his king back to the king side and cleaned up on that side of the board. It's a classic. And that's kind of the model that one uses in this kind of endgame. But this, of course, is different when black has these weakened pawns. So let's see what a difference it makes. Well, first of all, white's king comes up to attack that weak pawn on f5. Now, king g6, that's a crafty move. Could go king f6, but that reduces white's options. King g6 was a very clever move, actually. Right, here is where I would like you to have a think. And I'm going to have a drink. Cheers. How would you play with white? White play. What's your best strategy? Well, this is a crafty move because it invited Humpy to play king e5, which I'm not sure is absolute best strategy. It sort of sends white off on perhaps an incorrect path. Now, you could just wait with the king. You could move back. But if you do this, I'm not sure. This starts to get tricky. I mean, I think this actually should be a draw. because the king, white's king, can perhaps switch, just keep on the king side and just attack that pawn and get sufficient counterplay. But it's tricky. But to my eyes, the best way, the most straightforward way to play this position for white is to play f3 and g4. Create a passed pawn. You know, this is what we're always told to do in such situations, to create counterplay. So the h pawn will distract the king, but possibly the rook as well. So if you can imagine a situation where black's king takes the h pawn, white's king takes the f pawn, and then white's king will be closer to the rook's pawn. So, you know, something like this. I mean, in this case, we can move the rook across. If king g7, the rook moves back. If a4, then the rook gets back in time. That's okay. What else? Or I mean, h5 is possible, but you know, if king f4, then something like this, and you know, you can see that basically, I think white is fine in this position. It's almost like black has run out of moves here. King goes back, but let me see. I think the king can just move here, and I don't think there's too much going on there. Something like this here, king f5. So it seems to me that f3 and g4 is the way to go. It's the clearest way for white to make a draw. But after king e5, it gets a little bit chancy. In fact, straight away, I think rook e8 is an interesting move. And just the rook dives down to collect some pawns. I mean, maybe white can make a draw here, but the king is kind of on the wrong side, and that's problematic. I mean, particularly when you don't have a lot of time. But rook a6 played. Now, I think the king should come back. But king d5, this is definitely the wrong place for the king. And Divya plays very enterprisingly. f4, nice move. If g takes f4, king f5, this starts to get tricky. Rook takes f4, a4. Now this is serious with the pawn running. King f5, the king wants to come in here. So f3, a2. Now white is on the edge, with the rook completely passive. So what black would like to do is break through to the kingside pawns, leaving white's king really stranded. So rook a3, good move. King d4. Now f6 was played by Divya, but it seems to me the most straightforward is just to take that pawn and come in, because I think white's king is just really badly placed here. It's very difficult for it to actually come back to defend. f6 is still okay. And now Divya goes for a very interesting strategy, basically cutting off white's king laterally. I still think that this is the right way to go. This is in fact even better, pushing the king away and just going for king g4. Both players very short of time. It's very, I mean, basically they were guessing and feeling their way through this position with, you know, on intuition. And that's very hard. You know, these are the kind of positions where you really need to have the time to calculate. So she couldn't be sure that plunging in like this would be winning, but I mean, this does look very straightforward actually, with hindsight. Instead, she goes to rook a4. I mean, as I said, I think it's a very interesting strategy, cutting off the king laterally. So the rook can't move, the king has to move, and rook a5. And rook a6. The king is getting worse and worse, actually. It's kind of interesting. And now black's king starts to move. It could go in this direction. It could go towards here. It depends how much counterplay white has. You know, this is a thought to go for the h-pawn. g4, and white needs counterplay now. And this should be winning. Once again, this is the way to go, plunging in. And you can see that white's king is cut off. This would be the logical culmination of Divya's strategy to just cut white's king laterally. So basically this is just king and pawn against rook. But instead, rook a7 check. This is also winning. f5 should be a winning move now. But king f4, she's allowed the king out. And she now played, Humpy played h6. King d5 is the move. Watch this. After this, king e5, h6, a check. h7. The rook's pawn comes good just in time. And then, in this position, basically, the rook will give itself up for the pawn, and the king shepherds the rook's pawn, and black can only draw. So king d5, bringing the king back to aid these pawns is the move. But h6 played. f5. King d5. f4. And now we're back into this territory. King e5 should be a draw. But instead h7. I mean, this is an absolute roller coaster. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes a2. And this time it really is over because the king is so poorly placed. You can see the king, black's king is in the perfect position on the short side. So it can't really be hassled by this rook because the pawn will shield the king. And then the king, white's king, is so badly placed. The game ended like this. Rook takes h4. Check. The rook shields. The rook is beautifully placed. And again, white's king is cut off laterally. And in this position, Humpy resigned the game. So Divya Deshmukh is the winner of the World Cup Tournament 2025. Fantastic achievement for her. She becomes a grandmaster with that win, and she also qualifies for the candidates. Actually, Humpy qualifies for the candidates next year as well. But I think Divya, 19 years old, she's really dynamic, she's enterprising, she really goes for it. And although there were lots of ups and downs in these games, you felt that the momentum was with Divya. You know, she was always more enterprising, always pushing in these games. So a thoroughly deserved victory for her. Well, I hope you enjoyed those games. I think really interesting games, actually. I really enjoyed looking at them and spectating as well. By the way, again, I'm going to say it for patrons. Next patron-only broadcast is on Thursday, the 21st of August. If you're haven't signed up to PowerPlayChess Patreon, patreon.com/PowerPlayChess, please do so. Great way to improve your chess. There you go. Thanks for watching.